In 2006, I decided to rent a game for the next few days but had no idea what was available that I hadn't already played, as my primary gaming console was still the PlayStation 2. Walking through the aisle, one game cover caught my eye that I hadn't seen before: Yakuza. I didn't bother reading the back cover and just gave it a shot. To my surprise, Yakuza felt like a 3D side-scroller beat-em-up, featuring a fantastic story and a pretty enjoyable dub. I poured a great amount of hours into Yakuza before seeing the epic ending. 2 years later saw the Western release of its sequel and forced me to pull out my semi-retired PlayStation 2 to play through another fantastic entry in this underrated franchise. While the argument can be made there were quality dips during the PlayStation 3 era offerings, consisting of 3 mainline games and a spin-off, my hopes were incredibly high for the next Yakuza game that took things back to the series' unseen beginnings, featuring 2 of the franchise's most pivotal characters. The year was 1988, nearly 20 years before the series' first entry in its narrative timeline, and the country of Japan was in the middle of an economic boom that seemed to be on the verge of an inevitable downfall thanks to many factors, including the growing power of the Yakuza bodies that, ironically enough, are starting to get so greedy that splintering is causing moments of grand, fatal betrayal. Having played every mainline Yakuza release stateside, I settled in with a general knowledge of what to expect during my gameplay. Long-winded cutscenes featuring immaculate voice acting performed by actual Japanese actors, many interesting narrative shifts, side quests and minigames reaching into the triple digits, and of course a grand amount of fighting against both minor thugs and overpowered bosses. Just like my time with the previous games, I dove into the glitzy world while trying to build up my respective empires and literally investing in the main characters to make them fighting monsters. The time just flew by, and when the final cutscenes concluded, I had racked up over 100 hours. While one would think putting 100 hours into a game like this would feature someone fully completing the game, the amount of stuff to do to reach Platinum Trophy status, including beating the game on its hardest difficulty and completing the 100% checklist, would probably take 50 or so more hours due to the difficulty and randomness of some of the minigames. With nearly 70% of the 100% completion list, including the sub-stories, done, my playtime with Yakuza 0 is slowly coming to an end, as fighting climax battles, a mode where the player fights enemies under various limitations or stipulations, just doesn't have the same flair without the story to keep things interesting. Having been a fan of the franchise for over a decade, my expectations of what was to come from the latest iteration were not only high, but to a certain extent reasonable, thanks to the greatness Zero's predecessors accomplished across 5 games. And one of the main reasons for Yakuza 0's success as another mostly fantastic offering from Sega is its story. Though it is the 6th numbered entry in the franchise, Zero is a prequel through and through, featuring 2 of the series' most important characters: Kazuma Kiryu, the franchise's overpowered poster boy and lead protagonist throughout every game, and Goro Majima, who for the first time is a playable character. The near 40-hour main story starts off with a bang, yet settles into the stereotypical when Yakuza mafioso gangster tropes start becoming the norm. This feeling of repetitiveness is easily forgiven as the story switches gears from Kiryu to Goro and eventually back again, while this story of Yakuza infighting becomes greatly intertwined with the then current Japanese economic boom and its impending downturn. There are several high points in the story that go well beyond the expected considering how the story initially unfolds, and features an endearing conclusion that'll leave both longtime fans and those just giving the series a lengthy chance very satisfied. For those who have played the previous Yakuza games, the little odes and nods to what will happen in the narrative's future are there to reward longtime fans, but the story itself isn't hindered by the franchise's legacy. As any good prequel should do, Zero fills in the unknown blanks without condemning the player for not experiencing what came before it in terms of release. The voice acting and lip syncing are absolutely phenomenal, but for people who don't enjoy reading subtitles, there is no way you'll enjoy Zero, as there isn't any dubbing. Also, cutscene length might prove to be a problem for some. Cutscenes can be lengthy at times. Halfway through the story, there's a very monumental turning point, but the cutscenes that bring that moment together are almost 20 minutes in length. Thankfully, you can pause and even skip the cutscenes. While it isn't suggested that the player skip any cutscenes during the first playthrough, pausing and maybe getting a drink isn't out of the question. Also associated with the cutscenes are graphical shifts. There are several types of cutscenes seen throughout, but the initial moment of seeing Kiryu walking through Kamurocho is in no way indicative of how the rest of the game looks. Essentially being a PlayStation 3 port, Zero isn't the best looking game on the market thanks to a mixture of bland textures, building and townspeople pop-ins, with the latter being responsible for a few random unavoidable fights from time to time, and minor character enemy models being almost indistinguishable from one another outside of clothing. The gameplay is both mostly unchanged and incredibly different from what has been seen in the past. Kiryu and Goro can mix light and strong strikes with the touching of the square and triangle buttons in a timed sequence, grab and potentially toss opponents courtesy of the circle button, and evade with the X button. Both protagonists can block attacks and even counter with well-timed attack button presses. With each successful attack dished out by the main character, the heat meter located on the protagonist's health bar will rise so the player can unleash a brutal heat action that can range from a series of body punches to pro wrestling style attacks, including a suplex across a steel traffic rail. Beyond the fundamentals are the drastic changes to not only the characters but also the battle system. For those who have played the previous games, the innate sense in regards to how Kiryu plays is completely wrecked when one is introduced to the fact that Kiryu and eventually Goro have 3 different fighting styles, with the respective fourth being hidden behind 2 grandiose minigames. These different fighting styles force the player to switch things up from battle to battle with the touch of the D-pad when the fists, feet, and weapons start flying. For example, Kiryu's styles include a counter-based, mostly elementary version of his future self with Brawler, a fast-paced, low-powered kickboxer style based on evasion called Rush, and the heavy-hitting, weapon-based yet unwieldy and slow third style Beast. In previous Yakuza games, especially the 5th, you quickly become accustomed to each character having one way of fighting and adapt to that style. In Zero, the player must adapt to the fight and plan what abilities will help the player in the long run. One of the drastic shifts in regards to the franchise's battle system is the implementation of money. You don't just need money to buy the game's health items, play the dozens upon dozens of minigames, or pay for equipment searches, the latter being another extensive system added specifically for this game. The player needs money to actually upgrade the fighting abilities of both characters instead of experience points as per the normal previous Yakuza games. While beating up enemies will net the characters money, it isn't until 2/3 into the game when the player is introduced to the Real Estate Royale and Cabaret Czar minigames and subplots for Kiryu and Goro respectively, that one can make enough money to actually buy the outrageously priced upgrades through systems that seem complex in presentation, but are incredibly simple and player-friendly in execution. Both Real Estate Royale and the Cabaret Czar minigames feature the grandiose feeling of building an empire, but are terribly grind-heavy. Depending on how many sub-stories and completion points are completed and earned respectively, completing both Cabaret Czar and Real Estate Royale to earn those hidden fourth fighting styles and create true sources of wealth will take upwards of 20 hours. This is where the game's biggest problem comes into play, as the new implementations to a system that, while somewhat stale due to its unchanging nature for several games, hinders a system that still exceeds where other games would struggle to properly implement for 2 gaming generations. Needing great amounts of yen to purchase style and even health upgrades, both fighters start off horribly underpowered for the first half of the story, and could be underpowered throughout if the player doesn't take the time to really build up each protagonist's financial status. Kiryu suffers from this problem more than Goro, as all 3 of Majima's styles feel all around solid. Thug, the mostly balanced brawling style. Slugger, a baseball bat oriented style where the bat can practically become a pair of nunchucks. And Breaker, a flashy style built around breakdancing, outside of sacrificing a little bit of mobility when utilizing the Slugger style. Goro has the ability to thrive in battle a lot better early on compared to Kazuma. Even Kiryu's 4th style feels dumbed down and inferior compared to what Majima gets as his 4th style. The incredible Mad Dog ability where his Breaker style has a powerful knife in the mix. To really enjoy playing as Kiryu in battle, one must invest ridiculous amounts of money into his upgrades, something that probably won't happen for the player until the final third of the game. As per the norm, Zero is chock full of stuff to do outside of the main story, including 100 sub-stories that can feature everything from heartwarming moments, like teaching a cop to become a better police officer, to ridiculous moments, like helping a group of punk rock stars find their inner thug, and plain disturbing, like befriending the pantsless Mr. Libido. And there are even a few lumbering powerhouses that can rob Kiryu and Goro of all of their money if they lose a battle to these beastly men, though they can fight and win it all back. The great amount of minigames isn't hindered by the year the game is set in. You can go from playing Outrun and Space Harrier in the Sega-branded arcade to disco dancing or even partaking in the game's version of phone sex. A majority of the mini-games actually play a role in completing several sub-stories, including karaoke, mahjong, fishing, and even pocket racing, thus avoiding a sense of heaviness throughout, while throwing in quite a bit of laugh-inducing humor. Sadly, some of these mini-games are based more on luck and less on skill, which can produce some long-winded, frustrating moments when it appears completing a particular sub-story is nearly impossible. Plus, with every minigame playing a part in the 100% completion checklist, the game demands completionists to try out everything, and at times be really good in the process. There are also 6 trainers, 3 per protagonist, who the player can seek out to learn unlockable maneuvers. No matter where you are, both cities are brimming with life and excitement. Outside of the main game are several modes for single players and offline aficionados, with the latter being based around minigames, and the prior focusing on combat, but don't feel extraordinary or memorable unlike the main game. While Zero does have some problems, mostly thanks to the battle system and character upgrade experiments, the overall experience is something to behold, and feels less like an unnecessary prequel to pad a franchise already loaded with lore, but instead a once missing piece to the puzzle finally found that longtime fans didn't truly realize they needed, and a great introductory point to the franchise for people who have been too afraid to jump into the deep end of a series once requiring dedication and, most importantly, playtime across 5 separate games. Like its predecessors, Zero proves to be a genre-bending experience, part beat-em-up, part RPG, part party game that, while somewhat overwhelming thanks to the various amount of things the player can do without progressing the story, still feels tight and not bloated to the point of exhaustion. Fully immersing oneself in the world of Yakuza 0 can bring forth a wealth of different experiences, both negative and positive. But the overall feeling is nothing short of satisfaction thanks to an epic narrative, more mini-games and sub-stories than one could imagine would fit in a single game, and a mostly fun though aged battle system. Zero doesn't just rank high as one of the best entries in the franchise, but also as one of the most enjoyable experiences I've had thus far during gaming's 8th generation.